RSI, the Relative Strength Index. It's something that a lot of people use in trading, and I think that many people tend to get it wrong in how they use it, or at the very least, how they use it more systematically. I'll start by showing these two strategies, which I've labeled here as show inverse extremes and go with extremes. All that means is that in the go with strategy, when RSI exceeds overbought thresholds, it enters, and it exits when RSI reaches or falls below oversold thresholds. So effectively buying high and selling low, at least in terms of momentum. The inverse has the exact opposite entries and exits, entering at a low RSI and exiting at a high RSI. And here's how they perform. The go with extreme strategy, which buys at high RSI and sells at low RSI, outperforms buying at a low RSI and selling at a high RSI by a significant amount across history. Why do you think this is? And why do most people get this wrong? I think in general, most people have a significant bias to inverse momentum, especially across shorter time frames. But just by sort of the nature of percentages, you'd think it wise to inverse this idea. Because in going with the extremes and buying high RSI, you have effectively unlimited upside. If RSI simply stays at 70 for a period of time, obviously the underlying has gone up significantly, but not with the opposite case scenario. And while there are certainly times whereby buying at 30 and selling at 70, the orange line which represents that would have done very well because it would have bottom picked very well and even sold relative highs at points. Over the long term, this is of course not the case because the majority of returns in most systems come from the unabated extended rallies and from being all in throughout those periods. So while there are times that going against momentum works, in the long term it doesn't because you miss out on the largest of rallies. And in the 70s, for instance, which we would consider to be very choppy, going with extremes still performed the best in this case because it let you go with momentum. And if we turn on entries and exits, you can see why. Similar to a moving average strategy, getting out in downturns and not entering back in until an uptrend. And in many cases, getting chopped up, but the couple times that it nailed that was enough to make up for the rest of it. However, if we go back to the all-time chart, you'll see that across the last 20 years or so, things changed. This is similar to what we saw in the moving average video, where the moving average related strategies did very well until 2000, and then things changed after that point. And if we turn on entries and exits, we can see why here. There were just way more instances of buying almost exact lows by entering at low RSI and selling relative highs. Enough so that the inversing strategy actually outperformed across this period, though it still missed out on some significant bull runs. Now there's more to RSI than just 14, and we can change our parameters from exiting at 70 and entering at 30 or vice versa. We can change all of these variables. So let's do this and then let's look at how leverage can be applied. So instead of using 14, what if we use, say, double that of 28? Now that's a pretty interesting picture, across this period at least, outperforming to a pretty wild extent because it nailed some very specific entry and exit points, with RSI just tagging below 30 in October of 2008, exiting near relative high in January of 2011, nailing a low in August of 2011, and riding the entire bull run until February of 2017, before nailing a low at the end of 2018, nailing a high in January of 2020, and again nailing the near exact low in March of 2020, before riding the entire bull run up until August of 2020, after which it never got back in the position. So going forward, if we maintain in general trend, it will remain out of the market. However, I'd consider that pretty interesting. And there's a lot of parameters to play around with here. But before we continue, I would just like to show you that these do in fact match the real RSIs that we find in reality. December 19th, 2023, RSI was at 82.18. If we go on TradingView, we get the exact same reading. If we pick another date, say June 23, RSI was at 59.58. In reality, the exact same, which is of course because we're using the same calculation, but just wanted to show that it is in fact the same as reality. Anyway, let's look at that last example across all of history before we continue, where again we can see that it really only worked across the last 20 years. Inversing extremes, I mean, whereas the other one again outperformed until around 2000. In reality, I think your goal should be to have the go with extremes one outperform, and you'd like to find parameters that fit that goal. So let's try and do that. I'm going to move the period down to 20, and the overbought to 60, and the oversold to 40. We're getting a bit better towards our goal because we are continuing past 2000, but performance in general was a bit worse using this metric, at least for the green line, which we are now trying to optimize, We'll look at the orange line for that later. If we go overbought 60, oversold 30, we get a bit more of a desired picture. And why I'm leaving the orange on the chart is that it's telling us what the market is doing when we are out. So we're avoiding things like 2008 and some of the 1970s declines. And the reason we like this is because if we add leverage, we now outperform the base leverage index because we have avoided some volatility, which I would consider the end goal of this type of system. Because if you can still find outperformance while having periods of time where you're out of the market, your system is obviously doing something right, because obviously in general, shorting doesn't work statistically, and finding periods of time to be out of the market is also difficult to find, generally speaking. So if you can find something where you outperform, at least after applying leverage because you've reduced volatility, then you might have something. So let's continue. Now let's move RSI to 30, keep overbought at 60, and move oversold to 40. How does this look? It looks similar, but this is actually a lot better, and I'm about to show you why. Now if we compare the leverage versions, you can see how much we've reduced volatility. And of course, we have outperformed significantly in the end, which if we look at a linear chart, of course, becomes far more apparent. This seems to be generally around the sweet spot where you really are avoiding downtrends to a moderate extent. 2000, 2008, some of the drawdowns in the 70s, though of course you are missing a moderate amount of instances in between those where you get out at the bottom and re-enter at the top. It is what it is. And it ends up outperforming with leverage in the long run, which is, I would say, the goal. Now, obviously, as you would say, we are overfitting because we're looking at what did the best across history. Though when you're looking at 100 years in this instance, I think it's a bit more reasonable because realistically, I would imagine virtually every form of environment has occurred across this time period, at least for the most part. So it's not the best. We can't just create random data to point this to. We can look at other markets from other areas of the world, of course, but I already post that a moderate amount on my Twitter, so we're not going to do that to a great extent here. But let's do a couple more, and then we'll try to optimize for the other way around, and we'll give some final thoughts on what's going on in general. What if we do a similar thing again, increasing the period and decreasing the thresholds, in this case 155, 45. We again get a similar picture to the last one, avoiding major drawdowns, but also, of course, some bottom exit instances. This one I imagine really won't be as good, and it in fact is not. So in general, what we looked at prior seems to be the best one that we found, as you'd expect. Because as you go higher, it sort of just becomes like a moving average. And again, in general, it's very difficult to find periods or systems where exiting or shorting improves returns in the long run, even on a leveraged basis. So let's go back to our original parameters and see if we can't find areas in which the orange line successfully bottom picks, as you'd hope that buying at a low RSI would. I imagine your first thought would be to simply reduce the oversold threshold from 30 down to something like 20. If we do this, it actually does help a fair bit. But for the most part, all this does is actually re-optimize the go with to just match the market more closely over time. So what if instead of increasing the RSI period, we reduce it? I've done so from 10 down to 6. It all sort of gives the same impression, and that it doesn't really work. And it actually makes both strategies worse because there are so many more entries and exits. And in this case, we calculate a moderate amount of transaction costs to sort of mimic reality and slippage. So that doesn't really fit the goal, even though there are lots of times where it does lead to periods in which it nails bottoms and tops rather well. Like this period, in which case it nailed some direct bottoms and some direct tops, but even then it ended up underperforming. And in general, even in trying to optimize for bottom picking, it becomes a lot more difficult because then you're sort of just finding the parameters that get it to go long at like one exact low so that it can, do what it did in the one example where it did really well from 2000 until 2024, but in general failed throughout the rest of history. In reality, it's as simple as the go with extremes idea is just generally better. It's most likely better to optimize for that because your goal should not be to find something that bottom picks to perfection. You can look for something that signals that because obviously buying low is something that you'd like to do. But more imperatively, you want to find something that lets you stay long throughout an entire bull run, much more than you'd like to find something that gives you places to bottom tick relative lows. That should be something that you look for separately as an indicator, much more than a system of entering at RSI 30, exiting at RSI 70. Maybe you just enter it X percent at various instances of RSI 30, and I can look into that at some point perhaps. But entering at 30 and exiting at 70 generally doesn't seem to be a very good idea. And for the most part, it seems like RSI at 70, you want to buy. Just like, contrary to what you might think, you actually get some of the best returns of all time when you're buying the market at all-time highs rather than when you're not. And there are certainly some instances like the one outlined here with 20, 60, 30, where you do find outperformance when using leverage relative to the leverage of the base. And those are the ideas that I think you should be looking for, because at the end of the day, you want to be the guy who makes 400% in 1999 more than the guy who did pretty well in the 70s. And obviously there are, these are vast periods of outperformance and underperformance for each idea, but in general, it's the bull markets where you make the money going long, and you want to find the ideas that get you in extended long positions during those times, and at the very least just try to get out or find depleted positions during drawdowns, but not necessarily something that gets you more significantly long in a drawdown. So perhaps a confluation of this and the moving average direction thing that we looked at in the last video or 2 videos ago would be beneficial, because okay, the 200-day moving average is still going up. Then we look to buy relative lows in RSI, but not sell relative highs. And then maybe change that when you have instances where you have over 10 days in a row where you get that trend flip of the moving average itself. Something like that might be interesting and might be something that I look at in the future. But for now, I just wanted to get this done because I thought it was pretty interesting that you actually want to buy high RSIs and sell low RSIs, generally speaking, if you're looking at it as I am here. So that's about it. Like, subscribe. See you next time.